Hi there! Welcome to Explain This, the podcast where we try to explain complex things in simpler ways for people of all ages. I'm your host Jin Kim, and today we'll talk about what linear perspective is, why it's important, and how it completely revolutionized the world of art and architecture in the Western world. It's time to go deep! That'll be funnier once you learn more about perspective. Not. Anyway, let's get started. So for this episode, we're going to be talking about art and vision and light and all that, so it will require your imagination. I've added a bunch of pictures in the show notes as aids, so feel free to browse them ahead of time. Or check them out once you finish so you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about. And just as a small disclaimer, we're talking about the scientific principle of linear perspective as found in art and architecture, rather than the other figurative definition of perspective. I think that's important to point out in a world where people argue that evolution is just a theory because they've never been taught that theory means a completely different thing in the world of science, but that's a personal pet peeve of mine. Anyway, with that all out of the way, let's give you some perspective, heyo, and talk about what perspective is. Today we're going to start explaining perspective to you not as if you were a child, but don't worry, children will feature in the explanation later on. Alright, so what is linear perspective? Linear perspective is a very specific term referring to representing what the eye sees on a flat surface, such as a painting. You might already be thinking, oh god, Jin's gonna waste a half hour of my life telling me how to suck eggs because even a child can draw what the eye sees on a piece of paper, right? Well, you'd think so. Try this as a thought experiment. You can do it on paper if it's easier. I want you to imagine drawing a scene. You and your happy family, standing at the beach with seagulls flying in the air, a sailboat sailing in the distance, and a beautifully warm sun. If you're feeling particularly creative, feel free to adorn the picture with drawings of sandcastles and beach towels in front of you and your family too. And you don't have to be an artist making a photorealistic drawing, just pretend you're a child again and drawing simple stick figures or plain cartoons. Are you all done? Great, let's take a look. Now, most people would draw that scene with the people in the center of the drawing taking up the most space, which makes sense. Then they draw a horizontal line through the middle of the paper to show the horizon. A flat triangular ship on the horizon, with some small McDonald's M-looking seagulls in the air, with a big, glowing yellow ball as the sun. For fun, I've drawn the same scene and added in the show notes. Please note that my drawing skills are about that of a 5-year-old, so I thought it would be an apt example. Okay, now what I want you to do is, look up a photograph of the beach you're thinking about, or imagine the last time you were standing at the beach, looking into the horizon. How does it compare to your drawing? Unless you have eidetic memory or cheated by sketching an actual photo, your drawing will look different to how that scene would look to you if you were really standing there in real life. For example, the people in the drawing look much bigger than all the surrounding props. Boats in the horizon look tiny in real life. And the sun, well, if you're looking directly into the sun, you're probably blind by now, so don't do that. Anyway, the sun is probably much bigger on your drawing compared to real life. Anyway, the point is that your drawing won't have correctly scaled what your eye saw in real life onto the paper. Instead, your drawing will have a more flat quality with varying sizes and scales. And you think that makes sense because you're drawing 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional surface. And it's a drawing, not a photograph. You don't have to make it hyper-realistic. In fact, that's how people have been drawing and painting throughout most of history. Think about your favorite old-timey artworks. Cave paintings, ancient Greek vases, religious portraits of creepy baby Jesus, Egyptian reliefs with the funky pharaohs, Tolkien-esque maps. Even great artists like Cézanne and Picasso didn't paint things photorealistically to scale or with depth. And then take a look at some paintings such as The School of Athens by Raphael or The Last Supper by Da Vinci. In these pictures, you'll notice something magical. It feels like your eyes are drawn to invisible lines that lead you straight to the center of the painting. Not only that, but it feels like you're in the room, standing in front of all those people, taking a group photo. You can feel the depth of the room, like it's not a flat painting, but a window into another room. Heck, paintings like these by the masters are so good that you might even walk into one thinking that it was physically deep. You know, like when you walked into that big flat window and tried to pretend that, oh, it was too clean, so that's why I walked into it. So what sets these paintings apart from the millions of artwork throughout history? The answer, of course, is the technique of linear perspective. Right, now that you have a general feel of what linear perspective is, let's talk a little bit on how it works. Then more importantly, the history of how linear perspective came to be invented, or discovered depending on how you see it, and how it played a fundamental role in the Renaissance. I was thinking for a while what the easiest way to explain linear perspective was. Then I remembered there's a perfect scene that explains it from TV history. If you're a millennial like me, you've probably watched the wonderful Looney Tunes growing up. If you haven't, you just found yourself some quality content to binge. Anyway, remember that scene where Wile E. Coyote is trying to trap the Roadrunner by trying to trick him into running into a wall at full speed? I've included the clip in the show notes, so you can watch it as a reminder. What this clever cookie does is he paints a tunnel on the side of a rock cliff, then draws two diagonal lines angling towards each other but never quite meeting. This, plus the background shading, gives the illusion that the road is continuing into the cliff through a tunnel, even though it's just a flat painting. All he needed were two straight lines at a slight angle to create this illusion. But, of course, the Roadrunner outsmarts him by bending the laws of physics and runs through the painting anyway. Apparently the perspective was just too realistic. But the coolest part of the clip is when they show the painting from the side, it shows that the linear perspective only works if you're looking at it straight on. When you look at it from the side, you can tell that it's obviously a painting because the lines bend the wrong way. This is all linear perspective is, really. It's a technique that lets you create the illusion of depth through clever uses of straight lines, or sight lines, and manipulating the scale of things depending on their distance from you to make it more realistic. You can see examples of perspective all around you because that's how our vision works. If you look out the window or into the distance, you'll notice that things that are close to you appear bigger than things that are far from you. It applies to lines too, so if you have parallel lines extending away from you, the distance between the two lines will shrink more and more as they stretch away from you. You can see this if you're driving down a straight highway on a road trip, or looking down a straight corridor or alleyway. All of the straight lines look like they're converging onto a single invisible point in the center of your vision on the horizon. To use technical terms, we call this point the vanishing point, where all the sight lines are converging. The parallel lines look like they're joining up because of a phenomenon called foreshortening, where geometrical shapes get distorted because of the way light works. I'll include a bunch of photos in the show notes that really drive home what perspective looks like, but hopefully you get the picture by now. Using sight lines, vanishing points, and changing the scale, you can evolve a flat painting on the wall into a window into another world. It's said that when artists started using perspective in their paintings, people would actually walk into the wall because they thought it was just a door. So Wile E. Coyote's plan wasn't too stupid, turns out. Many of you may be thinking, Jen, all this stuff is basic. Even a child knows that far things look small and close things look big. Why are we even learning about this? Well, see, you say that, you condescending meanie, but then again, you would rarely draw things using perspective, like the example of that beach scene from earlier. And that's because there are many ways to project images on paper, and linear perspective is just one of them. For example, if you're a gamer, you've probably heard of bird's eye view, where you move along a flat grid, an isometric view, where every parallel line is perfectly parallel to each other, and you can move along it as a grid. Neither of these views depict linear perspective though, because objects don't change size depending on how close they are to the viewer, you. The same goes with paintings. Like I said before, nearly every drawing, painting, and other two-dimensional pieces of art showed pictures in a flat projection, like the Egyptian relief carvings. So as intuitive as it sounds, linear perspective is surprisingly rare in the world of art. And it's surprisingly recent. You won't really see examples of this kind of technique pre-1400s. And to be honest, this is the most interesting part about linear perspective. Not how it works, but the fascinating history behind it. So we're going to take a short break, then learn all about the rebirth of classical art, the Renaissance. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Okay, now that we know what perspective is and what it looks like, we can learn about how we came to utilize this technique. You're probably bored of me telling it to you again and again, but it's very important that you understand that linear perspective wasn't a thing for most of human history. Like even nowadays, children will draw in flat projection, even though it's intuitive that far things are smaller. Because no one used perspective to show depth in old art, there's some great stories about the use of various trompe-l'oeil, French for yogurt, deceive the eye to trick people. One is the story of an ancient Greek artist named Zeuxis and his rival Parrhasius having a painting contest. It's said that Zeuxis could draw grapes so realistic that birds came and pecked on them, Silly fools. Anyway, Perseus totally showed him off in the contest by asking Zeuxis to unveil his awesome painting. But when Zeuxis reached for the curtain over the painting, he realized the curtain was the painting. Damn. There's also a similar story of a Korean artist named Solgo, who lived in the Shinla dynasty. He painted a picture of a tree on the wall of a temple, and it was so realistic that birds would fly into it and knock themselves unconscious. So it goes to show that realistic pictures that showed true death were a rarity in ancient times. They were considered a masterful skill. And it's not to say that ancient people didn't know that we live in a three-dimensional space, or that they couldn't see death. I mean, the ancient Greeks already figured out the Earth's circumference to a shockingly accurate level. So why didn't they depict that in their drawings? Well, for one thing, they didn't know how to. You can see this in old paintings. Some people really tried, even back in ancient Rome, to show depth and distance. But if you look at them, the sizes are still off, and it feels a bit wonky, like perspective is all over the place. So you end up feeling like you're looking at a fantasy or a dreamscape. And that's because perspective is inherently very mathematical. Because you're using lines and geometry, you need to be very precise with your paintings to accurately create the illusion of depth. And back in the ancient times, they just didn't have the mathematical formulas to calculate these lines perfectly. So let's fast forward to the 1400s, when perspective was, quote-unquote, formally invented. Filippo Brunelleschi was a genius architect who lived in the city of Florence. If you've ever visited Florence, you'll undoubtedly know the famous Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, with the big-ass terracotta dome. If you don't, you should watch a Japanese movie called Between Calm and Passion. It's one of my favorite movies, and it really shows off the beauty of Florence. Anyway, I digress. Well, Brunelleschi was responsible for designing this awe-inspiring structure, which also happens to be the largest brick dome ever constructed in the world. So yeah, he was already kind of a big shot in history. But he also experimented and came up with how to use linear perspective to draw buildings and physical space realistically with depth. Brunelleschi did lots and lots of experiments by drawing all the buildings of Florence as close to scale as possible, exactly as his eyes saw it. Because back then, architects had to make mini models to show their ideas to clients and engineers, because they didn't have computer-generated models. Duh. And Brunelleschi thought, why should I make all these models? It's a terribly inefficient way to show off my ideas. So he wanted to come up with a way to show his ideas and plans on paper accurately. I like to imagine that it was also partly driven by laziness, because, to paraphrase Robert Heinlein, progress isn't made by early risers. It's made by lazy people trying to find easier ways to do something. There's a cool story about how Brunelleschi perfected his technique of drawing in linear perspective as well. He invented a contraption that looked like a canvas on a stick, with a small hole in the middle of it that you could look through. He'd tell people to stand on a certain spot, then look through the hole in the device to see a famous Florentine building. When the person would be all, okay Filippo, what now? He'd go BAM! And raise a mirror in front of the device, which would reflect the picture he'd drawn on the back of the canvas you're looking through. The reflected picture would be a perfect representation of the building you were just looking at, with perfect dimensions and depth. It was a real smart-ass way to prove that Brunelleschi had perfected the technique of perspective. I'll include yet another diagram of the contraption in the show notes so you can visualize it better. The show notes are going to be full today of links. The invention, or discovery, of linear perspective, if you really think about it, was an absolute revolution in the world of art. All of Brunelleschi's artist friends were all, holy crap, this is a total game changer! Like the forward pass in football, the slam dunk in basketball, the technique in haircutting where you put the hair between two fingers and you cut from the top. And it really was. Linear perspective changed the rules of the game, where artists were no longer bound to flat surfaces with the foreground and background just layered on each other. They could paint in depth now. And we keep coming back to that word, depth. So all the famous artists of Florence, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, Michelangelo, yes, the unstoppable Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, started implementing the technique in their works, mastering it in their own way. The first of these artists was a painter named Masaccio, who painted Holy Trinity back in 1427 for the Church of Santa Maria Novella. And yes, I'll include a link to the painting so you can see it for yourself, in case you can't travel to Florence and see it in real life. This is the first painting that we know of that shows evidence of the linear perspective technique. You can see the ceiling behind Jesus sink into the background, much like Wile E. Coyote's tunnel, giving the illusion that it's an actual gateway into another corridor. It's still primitive, with all the people being similar size to each other regardless of where they're standing, but if you pay close attention, the real use of perspective can be seen at the bottom. If you were to see the painting in real life in the church in Florence now, you'd think the painting is hung above an altar, like for its original purpose as an altarpiece. But on closer inspection, you'd realize that the altar is part of the painting, kind of like Parrhasius' curtain. They've even done studies to show that if the painting was placed where it was designed for, you'd have to stand in a spot where the perspective matches up perfectly, and you'd be fooled into thinking that the painting was atop an actual stone altar. And that's a very important point about linear perspective, by the way. As the name might suggest, perspective is drawing something as the eyes would see that scene, from a specific viewpoint. Most great paintings accommodate for this with some leeway, but for the most part, you need to be standing at a specific spot in front of the painting to feel the true trompe-l'oeil, or deception of depth, because it's all about sight lines and vanishing points, baby. Anyway, the people of the 1400s couldn't believe their eyes when they saw these paintings. How could you make it look like the painting stretches deep into the wall? There are truly stories of people trying to look behind the painting to check that there wasn't a physical hole, or people accidentally walking into the paintings like I told you before. So, like I said, linear perspective was a real revolution. And you might be asking, wasn't there another big cultural revolution going on in Europe around the 1400s? Specifically starting from Florence, Italy? Something about rebirthing old ideas? What was that called? Jen kept mentioning that word before. Congratulations, smart listeners. You've uncovered the secret context to the amazing discovery of perspective. And that is the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is a pretty damn big topic, so we're only going to cover it enough for you to understand the context and setting in which perspective was born, because it's pretty important. The Renaissance was a cultural revolution, where a group of clever cookies over time shifted society's perspective on, well, everything. The Renaissance saw great changes in art and architecture, such as the use of linear perspective for one, but also the revival of what the great ancient civilizations had already discovered, but lost in the annals of time during the Middle Ages. For example, the Duomo of Florence was inspired by Brunelleschi visiting Rome and seeing the awesome domed roof of the Pantheon, while sculptors brought back incredible marble sculptures and artists painted wonderful scenes from Greek mythology. Philosophers brought back the ideas of Plato and humanism to shift the focus away from religion and God back to people. Writers brought back storytelling elements used in Greek plays. Rational thought and scientific reasoning became the more popular mode of thinking, further shifting people's perspective from God to nature. And you can see all of these individual revolutions intersecting with each other. Like, linear perspective not only lets you build better buildings by drawing plans to scale, but it lets artists draw a more realistic picture of a scene, from a person's point of view from where they stand, not a heavenly image. A great way to summarize this change would be that people started drawing what they saw with their eyes, not what they thought in their heads. Also, linear perspective is a great metaphor for the Renaissance because the technique lets you paint a much bigger picture than the space that the canvas provides. Because you give your painting depth and space. It's literally showing you how human ingenuity allowed us to break out of constraints, a key theme of the Renaissance. All of these revolutions and rediscoveries cascaded until there was an explosion of new ideas and inventions, such as science as we know it, the printing press, and political systems such as republics over monarchies. It was such a massive paradigm shift that it was known as a great rebirth, or Renaissance in Old French. Side note, I still haven't figured out if it's Renaissance or Renaissance, so feel free to comment on which one's correct. Another side note, the term Renaissance man or polymath, i.e. people who are good at everything from academics to arts to general knowledge, comes from the great thinkers back then like Da Vinci who were well versed in all the different fields that were booming. It must be such an exciting time for thinkers, because new ideas and conceptual revolutions were happening everywhere. And this ties back into linear perspective, which you could argue was one of the first Renaissance revolutions for art and architecture. You can also see why it spread so quickly and prolifically, because everyone was hungry for new ideas and techniques and something fresh to try. So if we go back to the first painting showing off linear perspective, Holy Trinity by Masaccio, you can imagine how other artists of his time would have been stimulated to use that fresh, cool, hip style in their own works, improving on it and using it in novel ways. Two great examples of this would be The Last Supper by Da Vinci and The School of Athens by Raphael, both in the show notes. In both of these cases, they improved on linear perspective by not only creating the illusion of depth and space, but cleverly using the sightlines to their advantage, directing the viewer's eyes along the sightlines. For example, if you look at The Last Supper, all the sightlines converge on the vanishing point at the center of the painting, where the most important figure, Jesus, is. This contrasts to the old style of emphasis, where people would just draw the most important figures bigger. Which is funny, because that's exactly what children do as well. They tend to draw important things, like the main character or their family, much bigger, with accentuated characteristics like hairstyles or glasses. Because again, they're drawing what they see in their head, not what they see with their eyes. Quick tangent. There was a cool experiment where they got children to draw coins, and they found that children who come from poorer backgrounds drew coins physically bigger than the other kids, showing that our brain can morph our perceptions depending on the value that we assign to the object. So yeah, the Renaissance was a massive deal, because it paved the way for modern everything, from science to the arts, to how we think and perceive the world. And linear perspective was a key player during it. But that said, as prevalent as linear perspective was in paintings from the Renaissance, you might have noticed that you don't see it in modern paintings as much, specifically those from the 20th century onwards. Why is that? Are we entering another dark age where we're forgetting the wisdoms of the past? No, nothing as dramatic as that. In fact, the culprit happens to be another cool invention that shifted the paradigm once more. But we'll talk about that and the limitations of linear perspective after a very short break. Welcome back. Now, we've been hyping up and shilling linear perspective a lot this episode, with words like revolutionary and defying God and so hot right now, like a glowing review. Yet we see it kind of fade away, at least in the world of paintings from the 1900s. That's because it turns out nothing in the world is perfect, and linear perspective has its own set of limitations. If you look at the paintings that show off linear perspective that we talked about this episode, you'll notice a common theme. Many of them are truly impressive paintings, and you say they're objectively great works of art, but they don't evoke the same feelings and warmth and inspiration that other works do, like Van Gogh's Starry Night or Botticelli's Primavera, that don't use strict rules of perspective. Note that Botticelli is another awesome Florentine painter from the same era as Brunelleschi and Masaccio, but it shows that not every painting from them used linear perspective. And both of these artists showed off their mastery of linear perspective in other works, such as Café Terrace at Night and Birth of Venus. This is because linear perspective is inherently a very scientific, mathematical art technique. And that's not to say that science and maths are on the opposite spectrum to art. Those fields have played well with each other from the dawn of time, such as the golden ratio, or chemistry producing fine dyes, etc. But it does change the feel of a painting. A painting that showcases linear perspective meticulously can feel very cold and hard, because it involves a lot of straight lines and sharp angles. It also feels very controlled, like you're forced to divert your attention to follow the sight lines to the vanishing point. It feels like the artist is grabbing you by the head and forcing you to view the art in a very specific way. Hell, you even need to stand in the right place to admire it properly. So it's very different to other forms of art, the what you see in your head kind of paintings, that feel less real and more dreamy. When linear perspective was first introduced, it was very popular among artists who all wanted to try use this hot new tech, but it wasn't that popular among the general populace. People thought it was just visual trickery, not really art. They even called artists who experimented with it silly people who go around making holes in walls, which shows how much respect they got at the time for this revolutionary invention. You can also see that linear perspective flourished in Renaissance Europe, but it didn't really take hold in other regions, like the Islamic countries or the Eastern countries like Korea, Japan, and China. There are even stories of miniaturists in the Ottoman Empire getting murdered for trying to implement perspective in their works, because it was considered blasphemy to interfere with such a holy discipline. There's a famous book called My Name is Red by Orhan Pamuk related to this, which is on my to-read list that I've been recommended. So yeah, linear perspective isn't for everyone. But it is great for lots of things, especially when it comes to science. Because it's realistic and draws as the eye sees, it's great for building plans and scientific diagrams, one of its original purpose by Brunelleschi. And on a related note, linear perspective also brought about a great revolution in the world of architecture. One architect described it as the discovery of straight lines, where architects really began to experiment with and implement long straight lines to arrange space in an effective manner. Consider famous art galleries and museums, where you can see down a long hallway with beautiful sculptures and paintings adorning the sides. Your eyes are drawn along the sight lines of the walls to the vanishing point at the end of the hallway, getting a sense of being immersed in all the art surrounding you. The Uffizi Gallery of Florence is another great example of this. As a personal side note, I've always been fascinated by linear perspective since I was a child, and I always take lots of photos that capture examples of great linear perspective, such as hallways or columns or rows of trees along a street. Oh look, another convenient segue. Because what great invention appeared in the 19th century that totally nullified linear perspective? The photograph. You see, we've been talking all this time, asking questions like, why didn't ancient people just get linear perspective? When we're privileged to grow up in a world of photography, where we can see entire worlds without physically being there, like the deepest trenches of the ocean, to outer space, to faces of loved ones halfway across the world. You have to remember that photographs are a very recent invention, and for the vast majority of human civilization, people had no way to record the world visually in a realistic way other than drawings and paintings. And don't get me wrong, some people were great at drawing hyper-realistically, such as the woodcut of a rhinoceros drawn by a German painter, Albrecht Dürer, which he based on a written description and brief sketch of a rhino. Without ever having seen a rhino personally, Dürer was able to draw a pretty damn accurate depiction of a rhinoceros, albeit with some inaccuracies, such as having rivets in the rhino's skin because the description said that the rhino looked like it had plates of armor surrounding it. Anyway, you get the drift. Back then, there was no good way to convey visual information other than through words. And I know for sure that describing visual things verbally is very, very difficult, as seen from this episode. So linear perspective was a game changer because suddenly, artists could depict space almost photographically, with all the correct dimensions thanks to Brunelleschi's maths. But when photography was invented, this all became redundant because you could just take a photo of the building rather than painstakingly paint it over months. This is probably why in the late 19th century, we see painters move away from linear perspective, because you can't really compete with a camera's ability to reproduce the world with painting. The camera just does it much faster, easier, and more accurately. So artists such as Cézanne started painting without linear perspective in mind, because that's something painting can do differently to cameras. Go Cézanne. If you can't beat him, create a completely different style of tournament so you don't have to compete with him. Very wise. And that's why modern art has moved away from linear perspective, with styles such as Picasso's Cubism and also the abstract art movement being great examples of manipulating viewpoints to show a completely different perspective to what the human eye and cameras can see. We've moved away from painting what we see, back to painting what we can see in our heads, with our mind's eye in perspective. But of course, linear perspective isn't dead by any means. We still see it all around us in architecture, and also the newcomer to art, photography. That's right, even though photography completely destroyed linear perspective in paintings by making it obsolete, perspective is still a very important part of artistic photography. Because even photography isn't a perfect recording of what we see. Because of how lenses and optics work, like focal lengths, shutter speeds, and whatnot, there's still plenty of room for artistic license in photography. The way you compose your shot and the techniques you use can drastically change how a photo appears. If you look at some of the most famous photos, such as the VJ Day in Times Square photo, where the sailor's dramatically kissing a total stranger after the war is over, you can see the beautiful use of linear perspective. The lines on the road, the straight lines of the buildings, along with the varying heights of people depending on how far they are from the photographer, they all create beautiful sight lines that zero in on the center of the photo, that highlights the kiss and the vanishing point. Then there are photos that accentuate perspective through the use of fisheye lenses, or using telescoping lenses to compress the perspective for an otherworldly fantasy feel. So hooray! Linear perspective is far from dead. Hopefully you have a better appreciation for perspective in photos and art history. It might even make your next Instagram post more interesting through the use of straight lines and depth. Woo! So what did we learn today? We learned that linear perspective is the technique of drawing as the eye sees, so that the drawing appears realistic in its depiction of space through the illusion of depth. We learned that you do this by using carefully angled diagonal lines called sight lines that converge on a vanishing point, and by making close objects big and far objects smaller along those lines. We learned that linear perspective is a fairly recent invention, and art before the 1400s ignores correct perspective, and that's why art can look so different depending on what era it's from. We learned about Brunelleschi, Masaccio, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and many other amazing minds who lived in Florence during a time that we call the Renaissance, a cultural revolution that completely reshaped how we perceive and experience and interact with the world around us. We learned that photography was the undoing of linear perspective in paintings, but it also created a new world that perspective can flourish in. Lastly, we learned that linear perspective isn't just an artistic technique, but a complete change of people's frames of mind. It highlights the importance of seeing the world from specific and different perspectives, Because like Wile E. Coyote's painted tunnel, depending on where you stand and look at the painting from, it can seem real or obviously fake. So, as important as it is to be able to draw a single perspective really, really well, it's important for us to think of things from various perspectives to get the full picture. On that topic, instead of a 2-minute explain, I'd like to introduce a concept related to perspective to you today. Think of a cube, whether it's a cardboard box or dice or a Rubik's Cube. Now, how many faces of the cube can you see? If you hold it directly in front of you and look at it straight on, you see one face. If you tilt it up or down, you can see 2 faces. Now, if you tilt it sideways from there, you can see one more face, so you can see 3 faces at once. But can you see any more than that? The answer is no. Without using a mirror or turning the cube, you can see no more than 3 faces at a time. Which is a shame, because a cube has 6 faces, so at a given time you can only see a maximum of half the faces of a cube. Now think about this. If you can only see 3 of 6 faces on a cube, how many faces of a person do you think you can see at a given time? We all contain multitudes, with multiple facets. There are sides of us that we show at work, to our friends, sides that we want other people to think represent us wholly, while there are sides we want no one to see, except for those closest to us. And because we can't ever see all of the faces of a person at a glance, we make many assumptions. We assume what people are thinking about us, what their intentions or motivations are, and we become suspicious. As the famous saying goes, we judge other people by their actions, while we judge ourselves on our intentions. The person serving your food totally forgot your order because they're a prick. Well, you cut in front of someone in the line because you were distracted by being really stressed at your work, so it can't really be your fault, right? These assumptions can easily create misunderstandings and act as thorns in a relationship, hurting our ability to connect with others. Think about it. You can't solve a Rubik's Cube if you could look at only 3 of the colored faces. You need to constantly turn the cube in your hands to examine all the faces dynamically. People are the same. If you want to connect with someone and understand them, you have to make an effort to see things from different perspectives so you can appreciate who they are in their entirety. This is a core element of emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize why you or another person are feeling a certain way and explore it rationally. If you want to learn more about emotional intelligence, check out episode 3 where we covered it in depth. So next time you feel hurt by someone's actions, don't assume that they're mean and trying to harm you. Try to think rationally why they might be acting that way. Is it because they have something else going on in the background, such as stress from their relationship or being triggered by a past trauma? Ask yourself what face of that person you might not be seeing that might offer a clear answer on why they're acting that way. It's a really hard skill to fully grasp and practice, but trust me, it's so worth trying. Because if everyone tried to see things from everyone else's perspective, the world would be a kinder, more pleasant place to live in. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Explain This. I hope you've learned something interesting and maybe even useful today. And if there are any photos you took or famous paintings that you like that show perspective really well, feel free to share it with us on our Facebook or email us at explainthiscast@gmail.com. Or if you really want, show us a picture of the beach scene that you drew, because I shared mine, no shame in that. We'll see you next time. Bye for now. Explain This was written and hosted by me, Jin Kim. If you'd like to suggest a topic or just send a lovely message, you can email me at explainthiscast@gmail.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter